In the name of the beloved Son, for the sake of the beloved community. Amen. So it's Thanksgiving Day. The meal is done. All that remains is the wreckage, all prepared to be wrapped and put away. People are now sitting back doing various things after the meal. And then somebody says, you know, your great aunt's stuffing was so good. And you know what's going to happen next? That's the beginning of the great stuffing debate. And the conversation will go on from there, not just about stuffing, but about Thanksgivings past and what family has done and the stories that have come all from those things. That's the kind of cool thing about a meal, is the part that comes after can be just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the meal itself. My sense is that the Gospel of John sort of feels that way, because the Gospel of John says a lot more about what happened after the feeding of the 5,000 than it does about the actual miracle. If you compared the verses, you'd get about 10 verses on the story and about 53 verses on what happened after that story. The conversation begins with people tracking down Jesus. Why not? The man can make bread out of nothing. And in a culture in which hunger was widespread, this was better than gold. They track him down, sort of shyly inquiring. When did you get here? How did you get here? We thought you would hang around and maybe do some more bread tricks for us. Jesus responds, you've missed the point about the miracle, but I will tell you this much. You've done an awful lot of work to try to track me down, to give you this bread that can only last, maybe sustain you for a day's work. You should do the kind of work that will lead to bread that will sustain you forever. Now they're interested. Yes. What is this work? Tell us what we should do. Should we go and work the land? Should we go and fish? Should we go and be engaged in trade? Should we go and make fabric to sell? Should we go and do the work of building a home? What shall we do? What is this work that will bring us this kind of bread? Certainly, it has got to be work earth-shattering, tough, unbelievably laborious. To which Jesus says, this is the work that God calls on you to do. Trust in the one that God has sent. You would have thought that he had asked them to move Mount Carmel based on their reply. But you could almost see it coming. Jesus is talking to his own folk. This is a family conversation that's going on here. These are folks who know their story, they know their history together, and so their question is going to come right up out of that history. It's like, oh, we should trust you? Why? What signs are you going to do to prove to us that we should trust you? All right, great. The bread thing was wonderful. But that was a one-time deal. Moses gave us the bread from heaven in the wilderness. Not just once, 40 years. Not just 5,000 people, an entire community, all the people of God. Now, if you can pull that off, we can talk. To which Jesus points out two significant errors in their thinking. Error number one, it actually wasn't Moses that gave them the bread from heaven. In the alternate reading for our first lesson for today, it's the story of the manna and how it first fell out according to the Hebrew scriptures. It's a strange story that involves the early morning dew and quail and grass, and a very strange thing takes place as the Israelites watch this business happen. And when the whole thing is done, they look out and they see this white stuff on the ground, and they say, manna. I should tell you that manna in Hebrew means, what is it? That's how it got its name. It was out there, they'd never seen it, and they said, manna, what is that stuff? The name stuck and became a way of talking about the bread from heaven. So Moses wasn't the one that actually did that. According to the story, it was God's gracious hand that provided for them. And then Jesus begins that shift for which he is famous. He's going to move from this business of this bread over here to this bread over here. He's going to begin that argument from the thing that you know to this thing that's new, from this thing that is something you can touch to this thing that's a little harder to put your hands on. He's going to move from that story about that bread to something more satisfying, shall we say? And if you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, that sounds familiar, you're right. It is one of Jesus' great ways of teaching. He is constantly moving from what we know into this thing that we don't yet know. He's constantly moving from this thing that we have put our hands on and are very familiar with to something that we can't yet put our hands on. In the parables, he's doing it, talking about seed, talking about bread, talking about birds, talking about plants, all the while moving us to think about these things that are higher and deeper. The kingdom of God. The things that are happening when God is at work loving the world. And so here he is again with the crowd, wanting them to come along on a journey with him, wanting them to come along from where they are now to a new place of understanding. So he says, here comes the work. Trust me. Now, when the scriptures use that word, particularly the Gospel of John, it doesn't just mean have an intellectual assent about something, nor is it sort of a vague, yeah, whatever. But the call to believe is a call to trust and then to live. Trust me, says Jesus, and then follow. Trust me, says Jesus, and then hear what I am saying. Trust me, says Jesus, and go where I'm going. Trust me and run with the crowd that I'm running with. Trust me and do what I'm doing. Let me teach you. Let me bring you closer. Let me bring you even further along on your walk with me. Let me do great things in you. So it's a big deal when he calls us to trust. Now, for those who have first taking those first great steps of trust, we look at that and we say, that's wonderful. But sometimes we begin to forget about our own walk. Those of us who have heard the name Jesus a few times, who have walked this path a little bit, we also are constantly facing those new calls to trust. A new chapter in life that opens up, a new question that opens up. New stuff that's going on is a call to trust. I'm going to give you an example from my life. I'm going to break one of the rules of homiletics right before your very eyes. They always say that if you're going to tell a story about your life, make sure it's a completed story. Something that has happened so that you can draw the analogy. Well, I'm not going to tell you a completed story because I don't want it to be complete. Because the trust that I'm talking about is what's going on in life at the moment, real time. So I learned a couple of weeks ago that the company that I work with, Right Business Graphics, has been bought by a larger company. Well, now there's a lot of consternation and fear amongst us who are employed because we don't know what our future is going to be. Are there going to be layoffs? Will our company lose its name entirely? Will we remain doing what we are in our current location? Will there be new people coming in? Will there be new leadership? Will the pink slips start raining down? We don't know. To add to the fun of my life, I just moved yesterday because I am one of those who is affected by the rising cost of housing in this town. And so now suddenly my family and I are in a new community, a new place to live, and we're facing uncertainty. I tell that story because in the midst of it, this unfinished tale is still the call to me. Trust. Come with me. Walk with me. Continue to see what I'm doing. Continue to learn from me. And I have to admit, part of me is afraid, is scared, and says, Lord, I don't know where we're going. I'm uncomfortable. I'm on this new turf, and wouldn't it just be easier if you could just wave the divine miraculous hand and just make my life easy? But that's not what Jesus is calling us to. And it's not what he's calling the crowd to as he calls them to come along with me. Wherever you are in that journey, come along with me. Well, the crowd finally does get to the point where they want this bread, because Jesus is now talking about a bread that will satisfy them for good. And they're thinking, this sounds like exactly what I want. Imagine this, food that you eat once and you're done. Never having to go to the grocery store ever again. One time, you're good, you're finished. Bread that all I got to do is have once, and I never have to eat it again. Give us this bread always, they ask. Well, he's gotten them to come along. And now he has brought them from over here, talking about that bread that they just had, to this different kind of bread. And then he says, well, here's the bread I'm talking about. I'm talking about me. I'm talking about the satisfaction that comes from knowing that in me you can be secure about how you stand with God. You can be secure in who you are as an individual because it is unassailable in me. You need not wonder as you wander through life, is God actually honestly pleased with me? Isn't God really probably angry with me because of the times that I've messed up? Isn't God probably sitting up there in that big divine chair, looking down at me and pointing the divine finger and saying, bad, bad, bad child? Sometimes when we fail, we kind of feel that certainly God must be doing that. When we're going through hard times, we feel certainly God is punishing us. This is not the God who comes to us in Christ. No, no, no. This is not the Wizard of Oz version of God thundering in fiery face toward us. The God we know is the one who comes to be one of us, walks among us, gave himself for us, tenderly cares for us, even in those times when we are so ready to beat up on ourselves. God is ready to say, I don't want to beat up on you. You've done enough of that anyway. I want to embrace you and to remind you that you are beloved, that you are precious to me, that I have specifically given you gifts. But you hear, as Paul talked about some of those gifts, I have given you gifts so that you might do that work that I've called you to do, to trust and to walk. When we get to this point in the first part of this conversation where Jesus says, I myself am that bread, come to me, I do want to make sure that I'm going to put a little asterisk by that. When Jesus says we will no longer hunger, he does not mean that we should stop hungering for justice. He does not mean that we should stop hungering for righteousness. It does not mean that we should say to ourselves, okay, we're cool with God, so we can kick back now and let the world go to you know where and a you know what. That's not what it means. It does not mean that we should stop hungering for a deeper relationship with God. For we are always called to step further, come deeper. When Jesus says you will not hunger anymore, he does not mean that we will come to a point in which we can finally say of our lives, I'm perfect. I'm there. It doesn't get any better than me. That's not where we're going either. That hunger is the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing where we stand, so that from that place of strength, we can step into service and step further into ministry. I know how good a good piece of bread can taste. I have a friend of mine who works at one of the artisan bakeries in San Francisco. And when I would go down to visit her, she would always give me a tour of the place. And I would get that bread right out of the oven. You know, so steamy and warm that you have to kind of tear it tenderly, lest you burn your fingers on it, and you wait for it to cool, and you have that first taste, and you go, ooh, that feels great. Sisters and brothers, you're going to have some bread this morning. It probably won't taste like it came right out of the oven. It probably won't have that tender, beautiful steam that comes out of it. But I'm going to put it in your hand, and I'm going to say, this is the bread of heaven. For here, the one who spoke those words centuries ago will be right here to give himself to you and I, continuing to feed us, knowing that our deep satisfaction is complete, and yet always strengthening our desire and our power for the ministry to which we are called. Come, eat, drink, be merry in the one who has given us joy, and then go forth in service.